Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Tribe. I'm the chair of the MFA Fine Arts Department here at the School of Visual Arts, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce tonight's speaker, Carrie Moyer, an artist who lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. Carrie is best known these days for her vibrant abstract paintings, but I first encountered her as half of the two artist duo behind Dyke Action Machine with an exclamation point, a public art project that ran from 1991 through 2008 and combined design, humor, and activism to critique and perhaps remedy in a small way the exclusion of lesbian imagery in mainstream media. I became aware of Dyke Action Machine probably in 1996, 7, or 8, somewhere in there, because they had a really good website and really made good use of online and offline media together in a way that was pretty unusual. I think it may have been when I was on a grant review panel for NISCA or something like that. And I thought, ever since then, I thought, wow, that, and then years later, I found out, oh, she's also an incredible painter. Carrie's work has been featured in solo exhibitions at DC Moore Gallery here in New York. That's the gallery that represents her here. Mary Boone Gallery in New York. So the Savannah College of Art and Design in Georgia. Columbus College of Art and Design in Ohio. The Tang Museum at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. Galerie Suzanne Tarasev in Paris, the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts, the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, Canada Gallery in New York City, American University Museum in Washington, D.C., Roland Contemporary in Chicago, Samson Projects, a terrific, unfortunately now defunct gallery in Boston, Diverse Works in Houston, Texas, Triple Candy up in Harlem, Debs and Company in New person exhibitions with her partner Sheila Pepe, who's on our faculty and here in the room, at the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, at the Museum of Art and Design here in New York City in that exhibition that just closed, and the Suburban in Milwaukee, and also the Palm Beach ICA. So they've shown a lot together. Sometimes I think very collaboratively, other times perhaps less so. Long list of group exhibitions, and I often edit these lists down a lot, but I'm a little bit more inclusive. I'm including maybe 30 or 40% of the places because it really reads like almost like a map of interesting places to show in New York City over the years. And then I've tossed in all the significant ones that I was able to pinpoint internationally and nationally. So Miles McHenry here in New York in a group exhibition curated by our very own faculty member Rico Gatson last year. Anat Ebgi, excellent gallery in Los Angeles. Lehman Maupin here in New York. Alexander Gray Associates here in New York. Museum of Contemporary Art Denver in Colorado. The International Print Center in New York. The Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. It's a really interesting place on the campus of Ohio State University there. A group exhibition that some of you may have heard of, it's called the Whitney Biennial in 2017. The Rose Art Museum in Waltham, Mass. I think that's at Brandeis University. Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art here in New York. Clemens Gasser and Tanya Grunert, rest in peace, here in New York. Momenta Art in Brooklyn, also RIP, unfortunately. Art Space New Haven, still going strong, up in New Haven, Connecticut. La Mama Galleria here in New York. Mills College Art Museum in Oakland, California. John Connolly Presents, Commercial Art Gallery, RIP, here in New York. LACE, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions in Los Angeles, California. The Hessel Museum at Bard College in Annandale and Hudson, New York. The Abrams Art Center down on the Lower East Side here in New York. Ronald Feldman Fine Arts in New York. Participant Inc. Art in General, Algira Contemporary Art Center in Newark. This is a cool one. CBGB's 301 Gallery, RIP. Apex Art here in New York, Rotunda Gallery, important art space in Williamsburg, right? Green Naphtali Gallery here in New York, which y'all have heard of because they're still going strong. Thread waxing space, may not have heard of it, really significant and kind of weird, in a kind of weird good way. Tim Nye's old space down on Broadway in Soho. Longwood Arts Gallery, an important place up in the Bronx. The Centre National d'Art Contemporain de Grenoble in France. Center. I'm almost done. White cubes, white columns in New York. Exit Art, amazing. Alternative space run by Papocolo and Jeanette Ingbergman, and the University of Art Museum in Berkeley. That's just a really interesting list of places. So lots of university art museums and university galleries, but then all these other interesting commercial galleries and nonprofit spaces, very international, a very enviable list of group exhibitions to be included in. Shows how relevant her work has been perceived to be over the decades. Grants from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, grants and or residencies or awards. The Joan Mitchell Foundation, where she got a grant and did a residency. The Guggenheim Fellowship, super competitive, prestigious, and large. McDowell, twice, I think. Yaddo, Anonymous Was a Woman, Artist Pension Trust, New York State Council on the Arts, Creative Capital, back in 2000, Franklin Furnace. I didn't know you did performance. Is that for Dyke Action Machine? Okay. Peter Norton Family Foundation, Art Oh My, the National Studio Program at PS1, and Art Matters. Also an active writer, writes about art for, or has written about art for Art in America, Artforum, Modern Painters, N+1, Gay City News, and the Brooklyn Rail. Again and again and again, you wrote for Gay City News over the years. That's so cool. Also in monographs on Louise Fishman and Nancy Grossman, and countless exhibition catalogs and exhibition essays. Carrie Moyer received a BFA from Pratt Institute, attended Skowhegan, where she now serves on the Board of Governors, received an MFA from Bard, and now co-directs the MFA program in studio art at Hunter College. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Moyer.
That was, I didn't know I had such an interesting bio. I need Mark to read it to me every once in a while. It was lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be here. I am going to do the kind of lecture that I do often at schools, where I'm talking to young artists who are sort of developing their practice. And the first few images I'm going to show you are, I'm going to take this off. There's no one near me. Am I going to get in trouble? Okay. The first few images I'm going to show are just things that you might be familiar with in terms of my work. Mostly this group of works are things that were in the Whitney Biennial, so they were reproduced quite a bit. All of these are really large paintings, about 90 to 100 inches, and involve pouring and different technical aspects, which I'll get into in a minute. So this is the sort of flavor of what I'm known for these days. Very big abstract paintings, but also a kind of, what's the right word? I'm not that interested in discriminating or distinguishing between abstraction and representation. So that's one thing you'll start to notice in the work. It's like, I don't even know if that term is relevant anymore. A little bit about myself. I grew up all over the country. I had very itinerant parents who were basically hippies. So I moved all over country, but most of my childhood was spent in the Northwest, so in Oregon and Washington, Northern California. I kind of always knew I wanted to be an artist. And I'm showing you a painting by Arthur Dove right now because it's, even though as a child I was like, I'm going to move to New York City, that's where artists live, that's where I'm going to be a painter, that's where I can be out as a lesbian. Remember, this is like 1970. So those two things went together, three things went together. However, once I got here and started going to Pratt to study painting, I started to think about the paintings that kind of reminded me of the environment I grew up in. So I'm going to be showing you a mixture of my own work and then works that have inspired me. My work is in very close dialogue with art history. That's one of the kind of main pleasures of my life, is looking at painting, thinking about other painters, being in dialogue with painters in the past, and then as someone who teaches artists in the future. So that takes up a huge amount of my mental space. A couple more images of painters who were really important to me as an undergrad at Pratt. Lee Krasner is a fantastic abstract painter, was known for most of her life as the wife of Jackson Pollock, but is a knockout painter in her own right. And this is a postcard that I still have it in my studio. It came from my undergrad studio. So what is that, 30 years or something? Anyway, it's a daily, it's a work I look at daily. One more person before I start showing you my own work who was really important when I was coming up is Terry Winters. The thing that I have carried with me around his work is this interest in sort of macro, micro, and like how the how painting has this capability of telescoping us in terms of where we look, how closely we look. And so you might know his work, current work, he's still making incredible paintings. He shows at Matthew Marks, but they're much more geometric, even though they're still handmade. They deal with infinity in a different way than these do. So a couple of my own work, this is a horrible slide, bear with me. From my undergrad days, I was trained as an oil painter. We all were in the 80s, probably up until not that long ago. Oil painting was like, you know, the holy grail of painting. Acrylic was sort of seen as this substance that was too commercial, too plastic, too slick. And so one of my turns, you'll see later on in this talk, is to sort of embrace oil paint as a way to get away from some of the things I learned as an undergrad and some of the things that were sort of weighed on me as a painter. So the reason I'm showing you this is because one of the things I stole from Lee Krasner is the idea of cutting up your canvases and using them to collage onto new images. And so collage in a very different way remains extremely present in my work. A big drawing, you know, all sorts of female body parts swim throughout my work. You'll see this, and this is from 1984. So, you know, you do the math on that. And then one more painting from my undergrad days. So I was really interested in thinking about gestural painting, in thinking about biomorphic abstraction, mid-century modernism. It happened to be a moment in the 80s. I don't know, some of you might have worked with Gary Steffen here or Suzanne Jolson. Gary was somebody who was very visible in the 80s and making sort of biomorphic abstract paintings. And so he was somebody I was looking at. And so this idea of this sort of chaos or overabundance was something that I was trying to get into the paintings. However, I graduated from Pratt in, I guess, 1985, and dutifully went and got my own studio, was making paintings. At that moment, or not that moment, but that era was a very glamorous time in the art world. So this was around the time of Basquiat, Julian Schnabel, people like Clementi, David Sally. And it felt like an environment that was not going to welcome someone like me or what I wanted to say. Obviously that, to a certain extent, that was very my own internal dialogue, but it also was reinforced by the level of testosterone that lived in the art world at that moment. So I sort of was feeling uneasy, and eventually I just decided I don't even want to try to be in that world. And instead I started to get really excited about activism. I had been out since I was an undergrad. I'd been out since I've been in junior high, far ahead of the undergrad. But in the late 80s, the AIDS crisis struck New York, and it was this sort of massive turning point in terms of my life as a gay person. The idea that the government was neglecting all of these people who were getting sick and dying, and then the this kind of huge sweep of activism that came up around it. In other words, people who were being affected by this horrific condition were actually protesting and changing the media landscape. And so I was totally inspired by something like Silence Equals Death, the logo. Which, if you guys don't know what this is, you need to know what this is. This is like one of the most important logos of the last 50 years. It's up there with like IBM, Apple, anything like that. It's incredibly significant. It's significant right now. It is something that could be adopted by, the last 2 years of activism. This is an inverted pink triangle, which was the badge that was put on homosexuals, gypsies in the concentration camps. So I'm just showing you this stuff to sort of give you a sense of the environment I was walking into. Part of it was thinking about how noticing as a gay person how much I had been discriminated against, but then noticing collectively how these things were affecting my community. It was also where all the energy was at that moment. It was like, well, you don't want to be part of this kind of nasty, ugly commercial art world. Don't you want to change the world? I mean, it was, it felt like a very stark split at the moment. This is a poster that Grand Fury made that went on buses. And this is another poster or image by Barbara Kruger. I'm showing you this stuff because this is what I was excited about looking at. At that moment, I was like, I'm not interested in painting. I don't want to make something that will go in a corporate lobby. I want to make something that will have effect on people. Maybe I threw too many in, but this is, I'm throwing this one in because this was an incredibly cynical effort by Benetton, which was an Italian sportswear company. I don't even know if they exist anymore, to use a person dying of AIDS with their family as a way to make themselves relevant. And so one of the things I was quite interested in was, how do we turn this media portrayal around? So I started going to different organizations, Queer Nation, eventually the Lesbian Avengers, and started out very small. This is a little sticker that we would carry around in our pockets and put on posters and anything that was like too heteronormative. And at the time in New York, there was much more street-based advertising than there is today. There were things like phone booths that had ads on them. There were ads in banks. You know, it's funny how stripped the streetscape is these days of a kind of dialogue that was going on between activists and just passersby. So if you lived in a certain neighborhood, for example, if you lived in the East Village, you would see all sorts of information on the street. You weren't checking your Facebook account. You weren't looking at Instagram. It was a very different relationship to both a place and the conveyance of information. As Mark mentioned, I formed Dyke Action Machine with a photographer named Sue Schaffner. And this was a project that we ended up doing for about 14 years. Yes, is that possible? It's very hard to have a long collaboration, and that's why I'm adding that caveat. Every life gets in the way. So Sue and I met in the Lesbian Avengers. We both decided that we wanted to use our day jobs. At that point, I was working in an ad agency to make agitprop, to make things that would be in this very rich dialogue on the street. This is a postcard that we made about 4 or 5 years into our project, in which we came out as public artists. Up until that point, people did not know who was in Dyke Action Machine. So I'm just going to sort of quickly go through some of these to one, give you a sense of what the background is for the paintings, even though they seem quite separate. As I get older and sort of ruminate on this, I see more and more connections. So each of these projects that I'm showing you right now are basically sort of, culture jamming. Like they're taking in this case, it was a family circle advert. It was an advertisement for Family Circle. And then we put our own models in it, talking about the existence of lesbian families. This was based on an ad with Marky Mark that he did for, as he is known, Mark Wahlberg, for Calvin Klein. He was a sort of public homophobe at the time. So all of these posters were basically, we pasted all over Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn on the street. So during the month of July, we would hire the companies that were for hire by any corporation to wheat paste different sections of the city. And you basically had to hire these people because if you didn't, people would cover over your posters. So it was a form of protection. This was a project that we did during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, one of Clinton's first acts in office. So you could be in the army as long as you didn't tell anyone you were gay, which I'm not sure how that would work. But our idea was to create this sort of revenge film out of this scenario. Gay marriage, register as a, you could register your domestic partner at City Hall. But that was about it. So all of the benefits that straight people receive from marriage were not part of this scenario. Basically, you got onto a list in which the whole world knew that you had a gay or lesbian partner. And part of our work, if you haven't noticed yet, is sort of fundamentally feminist. So the thought that two women getting married who are already at the bottom of the economic totem pole, you know, it's like you'd be at rock bottom, two women getting married. So this idea about what marriage does for women is, I mean, if you studied the nuptials as I do, you'll notice that there are far more gay men getting married than there are lesbians. This was another piece of propaganda, basically aimed at the moment in history. What year is this? 1998, when it became visible that advertisers were trying to reach a gay or lesbian audience. This needs no explanation. The George Bush election. Yes.
We're such an international group of students here. I think some of these things there's maybe a certain amount of cultural and historical knowledge and specific people who spend their lives here in the States.
Okay.
I'm sure the name Bush is that familiar.
Okay, President Bush, remember him? Some of you remember him. So Bush is also a dirty word for vagina. And the axe that you see in the middle, I'm not trying to be facetious, I'm sorry, I'm just feeling self-conscious. Thank you, Mark. The axe that you see in the middle is actually called a labyrinth, which is the sign for the sort of lesbians adopted in the 70s for lesbianism. And basically what it is the axe that the Amazons in ancient Greece used. Amazons were these fierce warriors, women warriors, who sliced off one of their breasts so that they would be even more fierce. So what you're looking at is a labyrinth, which would work very well on scaring George Bush. So there's a lot of stuff tied in this. And if somebody has a question for me, please just raise your hand because I can see you. Gynodome, this is the last thing I'm going to show of Dyke Action Machine. This is one of the last or tail end of our work together. At this point, we had gotten a grant to make a website, but we wanted to make a website for a planet that didn't exist. It's very funny talking about all of this stuff right now because none of it feels odd or out of place, but at the time, all of it was odd and out of place. So there was very little gay or lesbian visibility in the media. There was very little discussion about the impact of gay marriage. There still isn't. You know, so all of these, there's continues to be very little discussion about how capitalism caters to certain demographic populations. So each of these projects sort of had this little kernel of a bigger thought within it, even though it would manifest itself in a very small, seemingly small item like a poster, or in this case, a poster and a website. So back to private solo studio work. I worked on Dyke Action Machine and a lot of other propaganda for different gay and lesbian organizations throughout the 90s. And part of me more and more missed the kind of privacy that is involved with the studio, in which you can do whatever you want. I still felt this kind of urgency around art making, but I actually think that comes from a kind of 20th century notion of what radical art is, or that art must be radical. So that conversation hadn't really died out yet. I feel like it's dying out at this point. So now here I am in this position where I'm really involved with graphic design. I'm really involved with using text. I'm really sort of known for being focused on one very narrow cause, if you will. And how do I expand that into my studio practice? What I did was kind of what I always do when I'm at a loss, which is I start doing research and I start thinking about other ways of communicating. So in this case, I'm going to show you some feminist posters from the 70s. I'm also going to show you Transparency by Frances Pacavia, who's been very important to me. So part of this amassing of strategies was thinking about how I would build an image that didn't have the urgency or didn't have the necessity of being read as somebody passes by on the street in 30 seconds, in other words. So how do you build something more complicated? Even though I'd already had a history of making sort of complex compositions, paintings, I'd moved into this space where I was thinking very much about a kind of quick communication. And the other change in the work was changing my medium. So I knew I wanted to go back to the studio, but I wanted to kind of teach myself a new way of painting. And one of the people I looked at a lot was Helen Frankenthaler and color field paintings and painters in general. Frankenthaler was very important in terms of the development of acrylic paint. Acrylic paint is only about 40, 50 years old. It was developed in the late 40s. So it doesn't have the baggage or the history that oil paint has. And it also has a relationship to other surfaces, other ways of manufacturing things, right? So oil painting really doesn't do anything but make oil paintings. Acrylic paint does lots of things. It covers, bicycles, it's a covering, it's part of it is a material to make objects out of that we use every day. So it lives in a really different place than oil paint does. And I'm just going to show you a few of these. I'm kind of trying to figure out my own iconography and my own a kind of images or symbols that are related to my own past. So here you're looking at, and at that point I started looking at all this material from the 70s, like pictures of, communes, pictures of people who lived outside of like the so-called system, and thinking about how my own family related to that and how that aspect of American life had not really been pictured in visual art yet. So a lot of these look like things like handmade books or photographs. Some of the imagery here is taken from photographs. There's a lot of collage. This is this has a peacock feather sewn onto it. It also has glitter. Probably one of the first incidents of glitter in my work. Still was putting glitter on a painting today. So 22 years, frightening. This is a painting of mine from graduate school. So I had this hiatus where I did a lot of graphic design. I did a lot of agitprop. I worked in commercial advertising. I worked as a designer. And at a certain point, I was like, I need to go back to grad school because I need to build a community around my painting that is not necessarily the same activist community I was involved in, but something that I could bring my own undergrad training to and sort of broaden my horizons in terms of how I was thinking about painting. So this is a painting from the year I graduated from Bard. And I'm starting to think about iconography, but also like how do I marry or put in dialogue two very radically different ways of making an image. One of them is to use something very flowy and visceral and such as poured paint. The other is a kind of hardcore, almost propagandistic use of imagery that is supposed to be easily recognizable. So here we have Lenin, Marx, and Chairman Mao in a burning cloud. The reason some of these images are showing up in my work is because in America, in post-60s, there was a romance with communism and amongst the left wing, and that was I grew up in that kind of family. So we were exposed to all sorts of propaganda, actually, and it became a kind of romantic idea about what the utopian future would look like. So again, I'm working with a material that feels almost like blood in some instances. And then an image that is very sharp, and the two can't and really don't ever reconcile themselves. Just going to show you a few images from this period. These paintings are all about 70 inches. And for this series that I'm showing you right now, I'm using historical imagery. So in this case, I'm using an image from Rodchenko, who was a Russian constructivist, who also made posters for the Russian Revolution. And I'm combining it with a image from the May 68 protests in Paris, which was an event in which students and laborers got together to protest in the street. And there was a huge flowering of graphic design around that time. Very recognizable. This has been used multiple times in the past by someone like Naomi Klein and other people who use graphics to sort of recall certain eras in time. This, you know what it is. Female power, right? Sisterhood is powerful. Anybody old enough here to have that book? Okay, you don't need to admit it. I know Sheila has it. I have it. This is actually on the cover of Sarah Ahmed's book. So if you have that, you'll have a copy in your studio. So returning to the sort of image bank and the, the well of ideas that I keep dipping into. And each of you, that's what you are doing right now, right? You're developing this place where you're kind of collecting artists that you're interested in and that you want to be in dialogue with. So this is a painting by Judy Chicago. Some of you might have seen the dinner party, which is at the Brooklyn Museum. This predates the dinner party, I think. Yes. When she was making these sort of fetish finish paintings. The reason I'm showing you this is because part of the sort of the formal attributes of a lot of political graphics and agitprop is this sort of command to look at the center, right? It's not a piece of propaganda is not treated like a window. It's not as if there's something here or here, and you're just sort of sliding the frame back and forth. You're actually looking directly at it. What else does this have in common? What else, you know, Christian art is also cruciform, right? So this idea of how do we keep someone inside the frame was very interesting to me. Agnes Pelton, there was just a show of her work at the Whitney, another American sort of transcendental painter. And then this little Venus of Willendorf. So I was searching for a language that both talked about a kind of prehistory that included female figures and representations of females, and something that acknowledged what had happened in the last, you know, at the end of the 20th century, right? The feminist art movement, the feminist movement. These are these little paintings that I made that I sort of treat as vitrines. So I started looking a lot at different kinds of pottery, different kinds of prehistoric art, instruments, things that would recall the female body as a way of sort of negotiating the space between representation and abstraction. I think my goal was always to sort of let go of the completely legible, as in when I look at that picture, I know what it's a picture of. I'm, you know, and this sort of begins this trajectory in my work. I want you to have ideas about what these things might be, but I don't want you to actually be able to name them. Uh-oh. Come back. Okay, did that work? So there's a whole bunch of these, like 20 paintings of these. These are about 40, or no, excuse me, 24 by 28 inches. So they're literally like a little isolated form that's an invention. And then they started to get bigger, and I started to think about, how does pouring destabilize the viewer? Can I use these both flat spaces and spaces that feel like you can sort of stick your hand into the image? And while at the same time sort of evoking lots of things like bones, prehistory, different kinds of materials such as, you know, algae or slime, or, you know, it's like this, you're not seeing any of this here because we're looking on slides, but to be in front of the paintings is to have this very tactile experience. Not as much in this period because the work is fairly dry. I'm also looking at a lot of cave painting. So again, how do we get the viewer to stay with the image? We treat it as if it's a kind of icon that holds space, right? This painting is 100 inches tall, so it's rather tall. And it's got all sorts of surface effects on it. The paint has interference in it, which means it changes as it moves, as you move from side to side. And I'm going to show you in a minute how these are made. I often start with very small collages, literally like about this big, like 5 inches. They become these kind of drawings that I make with a knife to set up a kind of structure that I then pour, that becomes like a container for the pouring. So you'll notice that there are different kinds of spaces in these pictures. often the background will be incredibly flat, and then something in front will have this kind of dimensional sense, or it will have some process done to the surface, which looks alchemical or chemical. And all of this stuff is basically just been part of a kind of learning curve in terms of using this material almost every day. And knowing and not knowing what kinds of effects I'm going to get. So these are some very old pictures of me that were in an article in Art in America, just sort of showing you how I make these. They're constantly moving from the wall to the table and sometimes the floor. So a lot of this stuff is poured, on the table, like really big. The painting that was at the Museum of Art and Design was 120 inches wide, and I'm sort of manipulating it on my own to get these very complicated pours. The other person who pours at gigantic lengths is Pat Steer. If this is something you're interested in doing, I think her longest pour was like 26 feet or something. No idea how she did that. But I'd like to be a fly on the wall for sure. And then they go back to the wall. So one of the things that's really important to me about making an image is I don't want you to know the narrative of how it was made. I don't want you to look at it and go, oh, I bet she did that first and then that came afterwards. I'm interested in having this image that sort of appears all at once. So that means I'm constantly sort of pulling layers back forward to the front. This is a close-up of the painting we just looked at, to give you a sense of what kinds of funny little pockets sort of show up in the paintings. And one thing to know or understand perhaps is that one of the sort of major taboos around abstraction in the 60s and 70s was the use of illusion. So illusion and abstraction, they just kind of didn't go together. It was considered, gauche or something. So there's something that in these paintings, I'm breaking rules that were very dear to my predecessors, right? I graduated from art school in the early 80s. So this is stuff that people were still talking about. So in all of these pictures, there's a sense of destabilizing the viewer. You don't know exactly where you are. You don't know where things are in space. And another aspect of the work that you can probably pick up on by now, because you've seen quite a few of them, is that there's very little gestural painting in these. It's either these flat areas that are made by hand, so everything is extremely precise, or these poured areas. And I think this is also initially, it's since become something else for me, but initially it was desired to get away from this idea that I had to invent my own mark, which was also this kind of fetishistic obsession of painters, post-abstract expressionists. It's like paint only does so many things. So, like Picasso, Franz Klein, Motherwell, they nailed these looks, and everyone afterwards will be second or third or 20th generation gestural painters. Obviously, the mark in terms of making a painting is just one element that signals who's made it. But it has been sort of historically this fetishistic aspect to painting, because it's like the painter's paw. You're actually touching the, you're seeing the mark go down. So for me, that was something that I wanted to stay away from. I wanted to think about how to put the paint down in other ways. This is some of the collages that I use to make paintings. As you can see, the colors have very little to do with what the painting actually looks like. Although in this case, the painting is pretty close to it. And this is a good example of showing you how the pouring works as this kind of veiling, where it's sort of pushing stuff away from us. So I'm just going to show you a few more images, and then you can ask me some questions. The other major influence for me has been Morris Louis, who was a contemporary of Frankenthaler, Helen Frankenthaler. And he was somebody that worked very closely with these different chemists around developing different kinds of materials. He started with this thing called magna, which was an early, very poisonous version of acrylic paint, which he eventually died from inhaling. But these are these huge paintings, which are poured onto raw canvas. Elizabeth Murray, huge is my word of the evening, I guess. A very big influence on me. She was somebody that I saw give a lecture when I was an undergrad, and have had that kind of love-hate relationship with her ever since. And then this person, Stephen Mueller, who I've sort of taken it upon myself to be the cheerleader for since he died about 10 years ago. He was an incredible craftsman. I actually curated a show of his work with my students at Hunter. And we were able to get around 40 of his paintings to New York to see them. So you can see from this one sample of his work that he is incredibly inventive in terms of how he's using the acrylic paint and staining, and the control with which he's gotten these different effects. The fact that he has things going in pouring going in two different directions here it looks, you might not even pick up on it, but technically it's very, it's like the Mount Everest of pouring, okay? So these are the paintings from the last, 6 years or so. All of them very big. A painting like this basically has to be done in 1 or 2 sessions. So the whole right side is basically one move, me trying to control what's going on the surface, and then hoping that once it dries, it turns into something interesting. Another painting that was in the biennial. One of the things I'm thinking about also beyond the idea of symmetry and how that works is, the sort of traditional relationship of a canvas to a window or a door or something that is impeded. So it's like looking through a gate, looking beyond, looking into. These are all these ways of looking that painting invites us to do, and are very pleasurable. One of the reasons we like looking at paintings, it's like, oh, I'm, being sort of transported into this other space. This was a painting that was included in the show called Queer Abstraction that Sheila was in also. This is a kind of subject of great interest with certain curators and artists right now. It's like, how do we talk about abstraction? What is the abstraction's relationship to our identities or our bodies? Why is it that for somebody like me, I was raised in an environment where we thought of abstraction as kind of like neutral, whatever neutral means. So these are questions that are coming up around abstraction right now. One thing I will add here is that Sheila and I have a lot of fun naming my paintings. She is the wordsmith, so if you need help, yes, I will entice her into my studio and give her some coffee and some treat, and we'll brainstorm. So you can see with this painting, Martha Graham's Candy Stripers. Everybody know what a candy striper is? A candy striper is usually a female volunteer at a hospital. So Martha Graham was the doyenne, the inventor of American modern dance, one of them. And so I always associate her with these sort of modernist forms, you know, something like Noguchi would do, these kind of, you know, very both architectural and bodily. And then Candy Stripers, well, there's a kind of sweetness to the image. A few more. Back to the idea of macro and micro. Back to the lesbian planet that Dyke Action Machine invented. It showed up in my paintings. This painting now lives in Australia. So I'm just gonna sort of go through these and be quiet because I've given you a lot of information. The things to notice are, you know, the relationship between this sort of graphic boldness and this sense of flat shapes in relation to the atmospheric or the poured. And then the parts that you can't see are these multitude of surface textures on all of these. So every aspect of this painting you're looking at has a kind of different tactility to it. And these are, again, very large paintings, 90 inches. This is the following three things I'm going to show you were in my show last spring, almost a year ago at DC Moore. I will be having a show and work on paper there at the end of March. So. And this is the last one. This was in the show at the Museum of Art and Design. Oh no, there is one more. No, there isn't. Oh, here it is. This is the show that Sheila and I had together at Uptown at Columbus Circle. Some of you might have gone there to see it a couple weeks ago. I wanted to add this at the end, both because Sheila is a faculty here and because I continued to collaborate with somebody after I stopped doing Dyke Action Machine with Sue Schaffner. So Sheila and I have collaborated on multiple projects over the last 10 or 11 years, and most of them were in this show. So check it out. I think it's on the both MAD and the Portland Museum of Art's website. So thank you, everyone.
What are your thoughts on works As an artist and as a viewer, what are your thoughts on works that are untitled?
I mean, as a viewer, I mean, I get it. I get the desire to not title things. However, language never pins down images. So, I mean, the way that I view titling, and, you know, I'll grant you, I have a brilliant assistant, more than assistant, doctor, painting doctor. I think what titles do is they set up a kind of arena around which the viewer gets to think about the work. You're never going to say exactly what it is in a title. It can't do that. But it's like, how do you want to surprise the viewer? Do you want to give them a set of parallels? Do you want to give them something poetic? I'd rather not look at things that are untitled, but also just from a purely utilitarian standpoint, dealers hate things that are untitled because they can't keep track of them. Just giving you a little inside info.
Hello.
Yes, hi.
I went to see your show at before and really liked it. Actually, I have a few questions. The first one is about the anxiety of influence, because Gary is also like my mentor. We actually talked about this today. And he was like it was 20 years ago, and you walk into an student studio, and if you can name his or her influence, it would be like the end of the world. But now it's not anymore, and you actually like very honestly show your major influence. So I just like wonder what is the contact.
That's such a great question. I'm gonna hire you to show up at every talk you give, okay? I love it. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not only up to me, but anyway, I mean, I'm just gonna talk about painting right now because that's the thing that, you know, I feel like painting is always in dialogue with the past. You know, that's one of the great things about it, and that's one of the oppressive things about it, right? So you're never going to escape somebody pulling in a name in comparison to what you're doing. I guess I'm, you know, I don't know how Gary feels about this, but I would say I still believe it's possible to make original images. I think they're an amalgam of things that we look at and we can recognize from other places. I don't think it's a matter of like inventing. I mean, Pollock didn't invent the way he painted. The surrealists were painting that way for years before him. So this idea that some single person has invented something is a fallacy in terms of the art world. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And also, in your painting, there are like a lot of like solid color area and the more like textualized or slash boring areas. And
right.
Sometimes the interact, sometimes like two different way of holding interact. I just like wonder, do you make the decision of that? Your way of dealing with different kinds of feeling.
I don't know that I have a very logical way to explain it. It's mostly, I think for me, the thing, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the paintings are somewhat deceptive because they look simple, but actually once you start spending time with them, you see all these things that don't make any sense, right? So, okay. Well, so in other words, I don't want, I will always go towards confusion instead of going towards clarity, which could be a problem. I don't know. One of my, secret desires, not so secret since I'm saying it out loud, is I know what it's like to go look at art. And I know that, people spend about 30 seconds looking at a painting. So it's like, how do you stop somebody? Like, what are the ways that you actually slow somebody down? First, get them to look at the painting and then slow them down enough to recognize that there are, there's a lot of stuff going on there. And part of it is we're, on the one hand, we're constantly looking at stuff on Instagram, which makes everything look completely simple. And then on the other hand, it doesn't train us to actually go and spend time looking at paintings. So I was at, where was I? I was in Akron a few days ago and then what felt like a huge amount of time talking about Ursula von Rydingspard sculpture. We spent about an hour looking at it, and it was like, oh, I need to do this to sculpture too. It's like it was so like rewarding in this way that I've only had with painting. Having this dialogue with like 10 different students and the faculty member, and just looking for a really, really long time. It's a very underappreciated. So, chairs in museums. Other questions?
I actually have questions. I noticed that most of the have like a lot of colors in it. There's like no like black and white, like there's no, not that you can only have like 2 or 3 colors, but just like wonder how you colors, like why there's so many colors.
That I cannot answer. I mean, one of the reasons there's so many colors is because the beauty to me of the material is that it allows for all these transparencies. So I'm getting tertiary and secondary colors off of almost every color. So, that's part of the fun of making the painting. But I'm always looking for a kind of vibration in at least one spot in the painting, like between, touching some sort of electric moment there.
Isn't that what painting is about? It's break up the city of, isn't that the center of painting color? Well, he had color too, but it was very subtle.
Yes, therefore I don't want to explain it. I mean, I kind of don't know what to say about why there are so many colors in my work.
You like it.
That's one answer, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering what you think about when you're making. Like these pieces are so large, and you said that the pouring process has to be all done in like 1 or 2 sessions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that takes a long time, and you're always like in the studio. So do you put music on? Are you listening to like other influences or interviews? Or are you like kind of going into your own head, like either daydreaming or consciously like thinking about, I guess more like technically wise, like how to go about it?
I'm listening to a lot of novels. I'm I painted one entire show maybe like 3 years ago, listening to Harry Potter, because I don't have kids. I never listened to it. I never watched the movies. And it was, but I don't know if it influences my work, but I'll tell you what it does do is it sort of relieves my critical. Yeah. It's like, oh, Jim Dale is reading Harry Potter. This is fun, or you know what I mean? And so I'm kind of painting and I'm just following my next thought. Yeah, it's like, okay, I will now do the next thing. I'm not going to get 10 steps ahead of myself. But granted, this is the processes that I'm using in the studio. I've been developing them for a long time. So it's not like I'm trying to invent something on the spot. I'm inventing in terms of how I'm reacting when something new shows up, because it always does. But I usually have ways of solving it that are in my, toolkit, for lack of a better word.
Figure.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? That's like, yeah, that's after many years, years of playlist of music, of like crazy music in the studio. And it was a big thing among all the finger friends about whose playlist had what in it.
That's true.
So
It changes.
changes, it evolves.
Yes. Nelson.
So slides are never gonna capture the lushness and the density and the vibrancy of your paintings, but it also doesn't capture the glitter.
That's true.
As a fellow glitter connoisseur, I'm curious what your interests and obsession with like putting glitter into the work.
Well, when I first started using it, which was when I was in graduate school, it was a way of, so this was the late 90s. It was a way of me, I was very consciously and almost self-consciously thinking about modernism, and I wanted to inject something that felt queer into it. And so that was a big part of that work. It was like, how do I tell the viewer that I have a different relationship to this history? Or what am I going to do with this history, in other words? But now, as I've used it more, for a very long time, for me, it's a kind of light source in the painting, and obviously a color too, but often it becomes, especially if I'm working on a canvas that has either a white ground or a bare canvas ground, it becomes something that's like even whiter or brighter. So it becomes this interesting, the color chart basically. And then I'm also using it a lot to make texture. Although I have started to use sand and other things like that too. So. You had a question in the corner?
I don't really paint. When I do, I'm always interested in the question of like how people talk about how they can paint themselves in the corner. Do you have any advice on what that would mean to you?
How you paint yourself into a corner, or how do you get out of painting yourself into a corner?
Questions, like those need to get old answers.
Oh, boy, I pay myself into a corner all the time. I'm always like, I mean, I'm in a corner right now, actually. And you are literally in a corner. Thing kind of giving me a little escape hatch right now is that I started doing these works on paper with Sheila when we were away a couple years ago. And it introduced me to working on paper in a way that I never had done before. Like I never really took paper too seriously. It was just something I would use to, I think I still had this sort of romantic idea where I had to like invent the whole painting while I was standing there. Even though they don't look that way, that's often how they're, especially not recently, but in the 2000s, like they would be, even though they look very tight, they were actually invented while I'm standing in front of it. So I'm not doing sketches or anything like that. But now I have a very different relationship. So I'm making these really complex collages that are pointing me in new directions. And it's really, I think it always is for me, working with new material. Like I'm totally inspired by the material. And it just sets my mind going. So if any of you are acrylic painters and you haven't been to Gera, you need to make a trip there, because it's like going to a candy store. Any other questions? All right. Oh, yeah.
So you also, you did some graphic design work before, so I just wonder how the, like, the way of like the graphic design in terms of like collaging.
Oh, it's had a huge influence on my painting. I can't remember what faculty member said this to me in graduate school, but somebody did. You know, they said, because I was very adamant when I went back to grad school, I was very adamant about like, this is the stuff that happens in the studio. This is the stuff I earn my living with, which is graphic design. And somebody very simply said, well, why can't you combine those two in the painting? And so what that did for me was it sort of opened up a strategy about making something that's compelling. I mean, that's one thing that graphic design does really well. It's like, you know, it's supposed to get our attention. That's the goal. And so it's like, how do you use that aspect of design and sort of combine it with painting? You had a question?
The work that you initially started with the poster, you have very specific dialogue with your with the public. That seems very different from what you're doing now. So I always thought, what's the relationship with you now and the dialogue?
I think that's a great question. Well, I think it's a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. It's much slower. It's more associative. I'm not trying to use humor to, you know, convince you of something or sell you an idea or use juxtaposition to show you how wrong something is or whatever. You know what I mean? I mean, I think that one of the reasons that we stopped doing Dyke Action Machine was because a lot of these tactics are part have fed back into advertising. So it's like, whatever change comes at this point, and this is long ago, I grant you, requires a whole different set of skills and visual communication. I don't think that mode of trying to get people to do anything is effective, actually, because people understand it as a conceit, right? So with painting, I think of them as being much slower, much more about the body, my body and your body when you get in front of one of them. You know, I think of it as something that is very pleasurable. Yeah, it's just a totally other way to communicate with people. Does that answer your question? All right, everybody, thank you very much.